Welcome to the podcast for AP World History, topic 4.5. Maritime empires develop. Our essential question from the AMSCO text. What economic strategies did maritime empires use to increase their power, and how did the developing empires affect political, economic, religious, and cultural dynamics? Let's turn to our course and exam description from the College Board. The CED, learning objectives. Explain how rulers employed economic strategies to consolidate and maintain power throughout the period from 1450 to 1750. Explain the continuities and changes in networks of exchange from 1450 to 1750. Explain how political, economic, and cultural factors affected society from 1450 to 1750. Explain the similarities and differences in how various belief systems affected societies from 1450 to 1750. So this podcast, the in-class lecture, my video, your CED notebook, when you do your progress checks, when you read the text, all of these things, keep these questions in mind. You should be able to answer all of these. There's no magic bullet. The podcast by itself, the book by itself, but a combination of these things, you should have this down. Okay. What's the big picture of this topic? Let's kind of do like a sneak preview of the things we're going to talk about. So again, we're talking about maritime empires developing. So what's going to happen in this topic, these maritime empires, they're getting bigger. They're expanding. They're going to go from small scale trading where they're bartering and, kind of a Mickey Mouse racket to you're going to go big time. You're going to go large scale. You're going to go from a garage sale to Amazon, and you're going to have large scale international trade. And you're going to be using gold and silver. These empires, they're going to come up with new economic models, things that had never been done before. One of them is going to be joint stock companies. This is really like the first corporation. I think you could make an argument. The Roman Empire started the first corporation, but that aside, this is where you're really going to see it come into play. Remember when I talked to you guys about 401ks and some of the financial stuff? The stock market, investing in a company, investing on potential growth. The joint stock companies, you're going to see this in play. But it's going to be a little different. You're going to see how different it is. These joint stock companies are interesting. They're going to be like a hybrid between a corporation, a company, and a government. And this is where investors, they're going to buy shares in these joint stock companies, and countries are going to invest. And you're going to learn about joint stock companies like the East India Company. And they're going to be big time players in this increased global economy, right? This global economy we talk about, in the 21st century with the interwebs and your smartphones and Amazon. But this is a global economy too. This is where the term's first really being used. This is kind of like their internet, their Amazon, what they're inventing here. The Atlantic trading system, okay, it's going to involve movement of labor, okay, people. And this includes slaves. You're going to get this mixing of African, American, European cultures and people, and they're going to, interact with each other, and they're going to influence each other in a lot of different ways. Some of it's negative, some of it's positive, some of it's kind of like whatever, kind of a side effect, and we're going to get into that. It's like the book uses a term like a cultural synthesis. And this is really going to hit home. I don't know about you, but this area of history really hits home to me. If you wonder the value of history, we're going to get into that. Remember these three things, these three S's: silver, sugar, and slavery. These are keys in the development of these mercantilist empires, if you've read your AMSCO book. Let's just stop for a minute, because the book doesn't really explain it. Don't let a term like mercantilism get by you. Don't just nod your head and smile and pretend you know what it means if you don't. You got to pump the brakes a little bit. And you got to, what the heck is that? Now, if you want the textbook definition, I can throw that at you real quick. Mercantilism is an economic theory, and this is not our textbook, this is from another source. An economic theory and practice common in Europe from the 16th to the 18th century that promoted governmental regulation of a nation's economy for the purpose of augmenting state power at the expense of rival national powers. Now, if you're like, what the heck does that mean? I still don't get it. It's fine. I'll break it down like this. Hopefully this helps. And this is a confusing topic. If you had economics, I can almost guarantee you learn this in your economics class. This is a big, big topic in economics. But if not, or maybe you forgot, whatever, that's fine. But I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but I want you to know what it means. Just mercantilism, simply put, it's an economic system. But it's kind of like an unfair economic system. The mother country, Great Britain was the mother country of the colonies. Remember from your U.S. history class in 9th grade. I'm sorry, not 9th grade. You probably had that in middle school. The American Revolution, right? The colonies. America gets their independence. We're no longer a colony. England was the mother country, right? Well, in a mercantilist system, this economic system, the mother country exports more than it imports. That's one key factor of mercantilism. Another key factor, it stockpiles gold and silver, these precious metals. The idea at the time is that wealth is kind of static. There's only so much, and you should back it up with gold and silver. There's only so, it's like a pizza. There's only so many slices. So nowadays that might not make sense to you because your generation has figured out how to make $100 million playing a video game, and people pay to watch you play a video game, right? So I think you guys have proved wealth is not static. But at the time, wealth is considered to be, static. They're using this to gain power, political power and economic power. So, this is economics and politics kind of intertwined. This is why really mercantilism, you should learn it in a history class and an economics class. And probably a political science class, I would think. But you're obtaining these colonies. So what do you want these colonies for? Well, a big reason, if we're talking about mercantilism, is their raw materials. Right, originally, remember we talked about Columbus in class? He wasn't interested in being in your history book. He didn't say, I'm going to go discover America. They wanted money. They wanted gold. They wanted silver. And he doesn't find it at first. But these raw materials from these colonies, they take them, right? And think of Cortez taking gold from Mexico, from the Aztecs. They return a lot of different raw materials to the mother country, and then they manufacture them into stuff. They make things out of them. But then they sell them back to the colony. So you're buying something at a marked up rate that was manufactured by the mother country, and they're forcing you to buy it. And if you want this is your only source. There's no competition. Why? Because the mother country is creating a monopoly. This is why mercantilism can be so hard to understand, because it's not just one thing. There's a lot of moving parts trying to explain mercantilism. So I didn't like the way the book did it. So they kind of glossed over it. So you got the mother country creating this monopoly. And not only can you only buy these goods from us, even though we made these goods from raw materials that we took from you, you can't trade with these other colonies. You got to go through us, bro. So this is, you know, this is like, you know, one-stop shopping. You only got one source. The mother country, in a way, is almost like a middleman, but they're in charge. So that old expression, will just cut out the middleman. It ain't happening. It's illegal for you to talk to these other colonies and say, hey, you know what? We got all these raw materials ourselves. If we just manufacture stuff ourselves and trade with ourselves, they wouldn't be raking us over the coals with their inflated prices. It's illegal for you to do that. So this is not a free market system here when you talk about mercantilism. The mother country is in charge for sure. And they're creating an economic system that favors them. So remember that. It favors the mother country with an imbalance of trade and a monopoly on this system. Okay. I just wanted to kind of do a side note on that. So back to our AMSCO text. Next topic is economic strategies. So I got 4 quick takeaways for you on this. In the 17th century, Europeans generally measured the wealth of a country and how much gold and silver it had in its coffers, which I just said while explaining mercantilism. 2, to keep this wealth, countries would also spend as little of their precious metals as possible on goods from other countries, hence imbalanced trade. The 3rd takeaway for economic strategies, the accumulation of capital, in other words, money, wealth, material wealth available to produce more wealth in Western Europe grew as entrepreneurs entered long-distance markets. They're expanding, okay, with this trade. 4, capital changed hands from entrepreneurs to laborers, putting laborers in a better position to become consumers and even investors. So you are seeing some distribution of wealth. The next topic is commercial revolution. Okay, here's the takeaway for that. The transformation to a trade-based economy using gold and silver is known as the commercial revolution. The commercial revolution affected all regions of the world, and it resulted from 4 key factors. The development of European overseas colonies, which we talked about, the opening of new ocean trade routes, which we talked about in the last topic, and we'll get into more, population growth, and lastly, inflation. These 4 things are going to kind of help create this commercial revolution. The high rate of inflation, or inflation is the general rise in prices. The high rate of inflation in the 16th and 17th century is called the price revolution. So we started talking about the commercial revolution. That's the price revolution, inflation. This was caused by increased population and increased amounts of gold and silver that was mined and put into circulation. Again, this is economics. I'm pretty sure you covered inflation in your economics class. But just in case, just for clarity, let's stop for a minute. What the heck is inflation? Your textbook definition, again, not our textbook, but this is like an economics book. A general increase in prices and fall in the purchasing value of money. A continuing rise in the general price level, usually attributed to an increase in the volume of money and credit relative to available goods and services. I learned this when I was a little kid from my dad. We were driving down Verner one day back in 1975, somewhere around there. And I remember, I'll never forget asking him, like, I thought about how, some people in the neighborhood, we didn't have a ton of money, but we, obviously, but we, I know people that were homeless. I know people that didn't eat well. I had kids I went to school that had no lunch, had no food. So I started thinking, I said, hey, Dad, why don't they just print a whole bunch of money and give it to poor people? And that way nobody would be poor. And he looked at me, he goes, well, at least you're thinking, but there's two things wrong with that. And I go, what? He goes, that's communism. I didn't know what communism was, but he ended up telling me. He said, well, that would cause inflation. I go, what do you mean? I didn't know what that meant. And he told me, he goes, if you print a bunch of money, the value of that money would go down. It's not worth as much. And the prices of things would go up because the money's not worth so much. So that's why you can't just start printing money. And sometimes when the government does that, they have to be careful because it can cause inflation. The value goes down because there's more of it. So I hope that makes sense. That's inflation. I just want to kind of stop. I'm just trying to think because, especially, we're doing this in 2020. It's online. We're not in class. Sometimes I can tell this by the look on your face if I lose you. But I don't have that luxury with this online teaching. So I kind of want to stop and just say, what question would I ask right now if I was in 11th grade? So inflation, I hope that makes you understand it better. Okay, so the East India Company, this comes up a lot. You're probably going to end up doing a DBQ on this too. So what the heck is it? Again, this is kind of like the first real corporation. Okay, it begins on New Year's Eve, 1600. And Queen Elizabeth I, she's going to grant a charter to the British East India Corporation. And it's a corporation, okay? The government conducted business in the East Indies. And when I say East Indies, I'm talking like modern day India and the Middle East. So the Queen is kind of like sponsoring this, chartering this. But keep in mind, it's a private company. It's very confusing. You're like, is this the government? Is it a company? It's kind of a hybrid of both. The East India Company was an English company formed for the exploitation of trade with East and Southeast Asia and India. So their whole purpose is to take advantage of these people and to really put the thumb down on colonies. So it's to serve as a trading body for English merchants, specifically to participate in East Indian spice trades, and they're going to add items throughout the years like cotton, silk, tea, opium, right? I think that's where they get heroin from, if I remember right. That's going to come into play with China too. So again, this is like 1600, New Year's Eve, it forms. It's going to forcibly, the East India Company is going to forcibly annex other regions of the subcontinent, and they're going to forge alliances with rulers of territory that they couldn't conquer. So we're really going to try to take you over. If we can't take you over, we're going to try to have a business relationship with you. Now, the East India Company had an army of 260,000 at its peak. That's the East India, the East India Company, not the country of Great Britain. That was roughly double the size of the army of Great Britain. So the country of Great Britain had about half that many soldiers. But this company, this corporation, the East India Company, they had 260,000 soldiers. So when they would get involved, they got the Chinese hooked on opium. Then this was totally illegal, and they were involved in slave trading. So they're drug dealers and slave traders. But technically it's a corporation, but they're chartered by the British government. They're kind of working at their behest, for them. Now, eventually it fails, but why? It started this monopolistic trading. It got involved in politics. It was really an agent for the British imperialism in India. So in India, you had the Indian Mutiny in 1857. That's what they called it. And it comes to an end in 1873. So you're talking, 273 years roughly that it existed. You also had some competition. You had the Dutch East India Company. And it was very similar. The Dutch. So let's talk about the Dutch East India Company. That was the British East India Company. Let's talk about the Dutch. They were for a long time like the commercial middleman of Europe. They set up trade routes like to Latin America, to North America, to South America, where else? Indonesia. Their ships, the Dutch ships, that were faster and they were lighter than those of a lot of their rivals. And most of the 17th century, this gave them an early trade advantage. And they were also a joint stock company. They made their money in the Spice Islands in Southeast Asia. So that's where their bread was buttered. So what also comes into play, and this is a big thing for AP World History. If you had me for World History last year, you should know all about that, because I believe my World History classes last year, you guys had to do your own podcast on this triangular trade. And if you look on page 234 in our AMSCO text, make sure you know this map. I've seen DBQs on this, using this map, come up a lot. And we will be doing one. So know that map on page 234. Kind of, sometimes looking at a map, it helps. It's better than a podcast, a video, or a lecture. Just kind of looking at it and kind of analyzing it. So triangular trade, the European desire. Okay, what do they need? They need enslaved workers in the Americas. Now, they tried to enslave Native Americans, but it didn't work. They knew the land. They could run away. They couldn't pick them out of a crowd. Which ones were we going to enslave? Which ones don't we not know? It is for a lot of reasons they couldn't enslave Native Americans. It didn't work. So, what are we going to do? We need slaves. Ha. What if we go to Africa? If we get Africans in here, one reason they want them, we can pick them out of a crowd. They're not Native American, right? So they look a lot different. We could pick one out. If they ran away, we can pick them out. It's just one of those strange things in history, man. It's this horrible, horrible thing that's going to happen, this slave trade. It was after the genocide of Native Americans. So just, it's one horrible occurrence after another. But the European desire for enslaved workers in the Americas, coupled with Portugal's quote-unquote discovery of West Africa, meant that Africa was going to become the source of this new labor. And I'm glad the book at least put discovery in quotes, right? Enslaved Africans, they're going to become part of this complex Atlantic trading system known as the triangular trade, because voyages, they oftentimes had these three segments. A ship might carry like European manufactured goods, say like guns, firearms. So we're going to leave Europe with these guns, and we're going to take them to West Africa. When we get to West Africa, we're going to sell a lot of the locals some guns. And now these are the locals that are helping us get these slaves. They're conducting slave raids. We'll talk about that in a minute. So you guys are conducting these slave raids. You're rounding them up. They're coming up and picking the slaves up. So the tribes they were doing business with, geography had a lot to do with it. It was like, okay, well, who's on the West Coast? When we pull up with our ship, who's there? Okay, we're going to work with them. So they go do the dirty work. They would do the slave raids and then bring them to the coast. So the British selling them guns, not only are they making money on guns, they're helping their own cause, because now these coastal tribes in Africa, they have guns, and the places they're raiding don't. So it makes raiding and stealing people a lot easier for them. So Europe was really kind of double dipping here. So they sell things like guns, and then they bring on, now their ship's empty, now they bring in slaves. They'd also get sugar and tobacco. Made a lot of money on sugar and tobacco. Sugar is actually the most profitable good from the Americas. By the 1700s, Caribbean sugar production and rum were financing these absolute fortunes in Britain and throughout Europe. So if you look at your map, so you'd see manufactured goods going to Africa. I'm looking on page 234. You're taking enslaved Africans to the West Indies. And then from the West Indies, you're taking slaves, sugar, molasses, foodstuffs, lumber to North America. Then from North America, you're taking raw goods back to Europe. Manufactured goods are coming back to North America. Rum is going to Africa. So, I mean, these guys you're dealing with drugs, alcohol, and guns. So yeah, please make sure you're aware of the map. Analyze that map. And there's also rivalries going on in the Indian Ocean. So don't forget, when you're talking about the Atlantic and the triangular trade, this is huge. This is big money. This is, in today's money, this is billions of dollars. There's still a lot going on in the Indian Ocean. So let's talk about real quick rivalries for the Indian Ocean trade. After Europeans stumble on the Americas, trade over the Atlantic Ocean becomes very significant. But while that's happening, states continue to vie for control of trade routes on the Indian Ocean. There's still money to be made there. The Portuguese soundly defeat a combined Muslim and Venetian force in a naval battle in 1509 over controlling trade. And the Spanish and the Portuguese would control much of this area. So AP World History, change and continuities, right? That's a big theme for AP World History. Let's talk about change and continuities in trade networks. And don't forget about the questions I threw out at you at the beginning from the CED and the AMSCO book. The trading networks involved a new global circulation of goods, wealth, and labor. Silver from the Spanish colonies in the Americas flowed to Asia, where Asians were eager to exchange their goods, silks, porcelains, steel products. They wanted silver. They're going to end up coining silver. Again, this is from the Americas, but Spain's making all the money on it, right? So there's more monopolies forming. So you're seeing exploitation on one side of this deal. You're seeing the inhumanity of slavery. You're seeing drugs and alcohol, tobacco, and you're seeing these things get monopolized. So there's there's only a few of all the countries involved here. You're only seeing the mother countries really benefit, with very few exception. Anywhere where the colonies are benefiting, for the most part, are minimal. And I'm talking, talking about, the indigenous peoples there. But some of these new monopolies, one way the patterns of trade were maintained, it was through these monopolies charted by European rulers. Okay. What does that mean? That's another word. Let's stop for a second. Like you read charter. It can be a tricky word. Like if my uncle from Texas comes here, we charter a boat and we go fishing, right? Like we're kind of leasing it, we're renting it. That's not quite what we're talking about here. A charter here is like it's a grant, or it's like a guarantee of rights, franchises, or privileges from the sovereign power of a state or country. Like, this is ours, nobody can touch it. We run this. We don't have to worry about competition because there isn't going to be any. So the combination of a monopoly and a charter, you're printing money. You don't have any competition. You're running the show until somebody physically takes you out. You're running things. The Spanish government established a monopoly first over like domestic tobacco that was grown, and all the tobacco grown in its American colonies. So Spain had a lockdown on tobacco, total monopoly. You want tobacco? If you bought tobacco, Spain made money off of you. Tobacco was like 1/3 of all of their revenues, the country of Spain. So they're making huge money on tobacco. At the same time, there's some of these like regional markets, and they're going to flourish in Afro-Eurasia. Okay, again, let's stop for a minute. What the heck's Afro-Eurasia? Like, how many guys have been reading the book and you see Afro-Eurasia, you're not really sure where it is. Don't do that. Use your Google machine. Use your smartphone. Ask me in class. Don't let things get by you like that. Because don't forget, One thing about standardized tests, multiple choice tests, whether it's an SAT, an ACT, AP World History test, any of your AP classes, one reason the data shows that students get a question wrong, it's not necessarily that they didn't understand the content or they didn't understand the process of figuring out the right answer. It's not so much a thing of analytics. There's a word in a question. They don't know what that word means. It's an issue of vocabulary. If their vocabulary was a little better, they could have got the right answer. But not knowing what something in the question means, and that happens to all of us, right? So that's why I encourage you, ask questions. Obviously, you can't ask me a question in the middle of a podcast, but either email me, ask me in class, use your Google machine, something. Don't let these things get by you. And don't think you're the only one. Don't think you're the only one that doesn't know what Afro-Eurasia is, right? So it's really just it's pretty much just 3 continents. It's pretty much, the major population of the earth. It's Africa, Europe, and Asia. Afro-Eurasia. So if you watch the video, the companion video to this topic that I'm going to make, I'm going to put a map on there. It's just Africa, Europe, and Asia. That's it. No big deal. Okay. So these regional markets, improved shipping is going to offer merchants the opportunity to increase their volume of products. The increasing output of peasant and artisan labor, wool and linen from Western Europe, cotton from India, silk from China, exchange hands in port cities with global connections. Okay, and again, this stuff is stuff that's right in the CE notebook. I think that's some of your illustrative examples as well. So, we're addressing not just the AMSCO book, but the CED. And we're trying to hit, all the marks. Now, AP World History, right? Continuity and change. Cause and effects is also big. What were the effects of the Atlantic slave trade? Let's go over some of the effects. The Atlantic slave trade greatly weakened several West African kingdoms, such as Congo. That's kind of obvious for obvious reasons, right? The loss of so many people slowed population growth. Trade competition led to violence among their societies, but also made African slave-raiding kingdoms economically dependent on goods from Europe. Now, a lot of people might think, well, I don't have too much sympathy for them. They were helping, they sold out their own people to sell it to the Europeans. But that is when they were getting the guns and other goods, manufactured goods from Europe, they kind of became dependent on it. And again, Europe likes this. It's the thing, mercantilism, these charters, these monopolies. The mother countries are the big winners here, right? Such societies were slow to develop more complex economies in which they produced their own goods. So it kind of stagnates a lot of places in the world. You're really dependent on the mother country. They really got you under their thumb, politically, economically. And the other thing about the slave trade at the time, obviously it's horrible. Right? We've talked about this. But it's also kind of planting the seed, setting the stage, whatever language you want to use. This is going to be a springboard for European conquest and imperialism in the late 19th century, which we'll talk about. We're going to talk about like De Beer diamonds and stuff. You're going to see this is really laying the groundwork for taking over and exploiting these countries and these regions even more. Okay, let's talk economics here. Economically, African societies that conducted slave raids, such as the Dahomey and Oyo, became richer from selling their captives to Europeans. So I'll show you a map of that in my companion video. But like Dahomey and Oyo, they're making more money, but it's at a hell of a cost. They're enslaving their own people, right? The neighboring slave raids, and they're doing the dirty work for the Europeans. They got money for it. And we've seen this before in history too. This isn't This isn't just applied to Africa. We talked about Cortez. If it wasn't for the help from other tribes like the Tlaxcalans, he never would have beat the Aztecs, right? So we've seen this happen before. Okay, this trade also has a political impact, political effects, right? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about effects. Because when a society such as like the Dahomey exchanged slaves for guns, its raiders easily took advantage of rival societies that had no firearms. It gives them a huge advantage, which I mentioned. Intergroup warfare thus became more common and bloodier as a result of the slave trade. So, Africans fighting other Africans and killing other Africans and selling other Africans to the slave trade. These are all just horrible effects that the triangular trade is having on them. Okay, let's talk about slavery and gender. Those most affected by the slave trade were the peoples and civilizations of West Africa in present-day Ghana and Benin, from which most Africans were kidnapped or sold. Again, why do we keep talking about West Africa? It's simple geography. They're by the Atlantic Ocean. Gender distributions in those regions became severely imbalanced because more than 2/3 of Africans that were taken on the ships to be sold as slaves were male. So this resulted in things like polygamy, the taking of more than one wife, and it's going to force women to take on duties that were traditionally been held by men. Because there's so many women, right? And so few men, because so many of them are being ripped from their homes and being sold in slavery. Now there's an impact on new foods too. The Atlantic trading system weakened Africa in many ways, but one strange side effect here, it's going to spur, there's the obvious depopulation, but it's going to spur a population growth through an improved diet. So all the negative effects we talked about, which are pretty obvious, here's one. I guess you could say it's a positive effect. I hate to say anything positive about the slave trade, but the book talked about this, that an improved diet is going to spur population growth. The Columbian Exchange introduced new things to the continent food-wise, like maize, corn, peanuts, cassava. So they had new things that they could eat. Let's talk about political and cultural changes for indigenous peoples. Earlier, land-based empires, they often grappled how to deal with conquered people. Sometimes they just left them alone. Remember when we talked about the Mongols? One reason the Mongols were able to build such a huge connected land-based empire, the largest ever, they didn't micromanage. Remember we talked about how they kind of left people like, listen, you can keep doing things the way you're doing, but you answer to us. Cool. They left it alone. They didn't have to recreate something. They didn't have to leave a lot of people to babysit, so that, it made conquering more efficient for them. But sometimes what we're seeing here, that didn't always work. And they would impose their beliefs and customs onto the conquered people. So the Spanish and the Portuguese empires managed to erase the basic social structures and many of the cultural traditions of the indigenous Americans within a century of the first European explorers arrived was gone. You literally erased these people's history. And I said in the beginning of the podcast how this topic hits home with me. I always got a lot of flack because I'm half Mexican, especially being in Southwest Detroit, because I don't speak Spanish. It's a long story. My dad's side of the family moved to Houston after the riots to take their business down there, because business on Vernon was bad. My grandparents had a pool room on Vernon. We had riots in '68, and it messed up their business. So they took it down south, and they did much better. But I wasn't in touch with, my Mexican side of the family. My dad worked nights, so I always got, people always busted my chops about that. They still do. And I wish I could learn Spanish. I need to. But I'll never forget one time, long time ago, I'm at a party and this girl's like, your last name's Cruz? How do you not speak Spanish? And she's really giving me the business. She's really busting my chops. So I'm like getting irritated. I'm like, well, I wish I did, but, really, you don't speak your native language either. Because she was telling me, how can you not speak your native language? Blah, blah, blah. She said, well, what's that supposed to mean? I said, well, you speak the language of the conquerors of Mexico. And you go to church. So I knew her from St. Gabe's. You practice the religion and you speak the language of your conquerors. Now that was like in 1987. That girl still hasn't spoken to me. And she probably never will. So, that just really hits home with me. And I think anybody that ever says, especially here in the Southwest, how can you not see how this history has affected you? I mean, a lot of us are in Southwest. We're at Western right now because of this history. So I think a lot of these effects should be obvious, and this should be more than just, you trying to pass a test. I mean, you should understand how this history affects us today in 2020. Okay, but European actions, they almost depopulate the America. This is so just tragic for the indigenous peoples. They almost just wipe them off the planet. And we talked about that with smallpox. Okay, let's talk about some political changes. Colonial administration, indigenous political structures in Latin America were soon replaced by Spanish and Portuguese colonial administrators. Spanish royalty appointed viceroys. Okay, that's a bold word, vocabulary word. Viceroys to act as administrators and representatives of the Spanish crown. Then he established audiencias, like these royal courts, in which Spanish settlers, they could appeal viceroys' decisions or policies. They're trying to get a system. They want people to come here and try to, do something, make some money, set something up. So you got to have some kind of law and order, right? But due to the distance, you got the whole Atlantic Ocean there. Spain, they're finding like it's hard for them to really enforce anything. And Spain slowly, like, there's too much work. We can't, there's no way we can micromanage something. It's on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. And they kind of just don't focus so much on the Western Hemisphere. Okay, then there's cultural changes. The indigenous people of the Americas, they lose a great deal of their culture, their history. We talked about this. Cortez, like in Mexico, besides smallpox, besides, the death and the destruction he caused, one thing he did, just to show you the value of history and books, he burned a lot of the native books. So a lot of Mexican history, language, their history, their art was destroyed. I mean, literally erased. So all that's taken away from you as a culture, as a people. Now, there's some places I thought it was so cool. I think it was last year. I had a student. She was from Guatemala, and it was so cool, man. Her grandmother and her mother taught her, the indigenous language. She spoke Spanish, she spoke English, and I feel bad, I forgot the name of it. But she spoke the indigenous language of Guatemala. So there's some places that still have that in the indigenous language, right? There's some places in Mexico too, like these mountainous regions where the indigenous languages still exist. It's not just Spanish, so you can still find out what was, our real language before we were conquered by Spain. This is a huge cultural change, obviously. For the most part, Spanish and Portuguese conquerors transplanted their own languages and religion to the Americas. So you got people that spoke a native language that are now speaking Spanish. They had polytheistic religions, all these different gods, polytheism. Their conquerors said, nope, you got rid of all that, and you're going to be monotheistic, Catholic Church, Christianity. So that's a huge effect. Again, we're not just talking about this time frame. We're talking today, right now. By 1750, those born in America of Spanish origin were called Creoles, and they enjoyed political dominance in New Spain. They soon began clamoring for independence from the Spanish throne. So they kind of want to make their own way. So the effects on belief systems, the increase in intensity of newly established global connections between hemispheres extended the reach of existing religions. In some areas, you had this syncretic belief system. It's kind of like a hybrid. Okay, syncretic is another term in the book. You could kind of gloss over it and not really know what it means. It's kind of like a hybrid where, okay, we're going to, like in this case, we're going to adopt Christianity, but we're still going to kind of keep some of our traditions. It's going to be a mix. You saw this in Africa. Like they would adapt Christianity. It was most of the time it was, Roman Catholicism, but they still kept a lot of their traditions, their cultural traditions alive. The drumming, the dancing, the belief that spirits could take over and act through a person, so it was like a mixing of the two. Santeria is an example. It means the way of the saints. It's originally an African faith, but it became popular in Cuba, and then it traveled through Latin America and North America. Let's talk about Islam for a minute. About 1 in 10 of the enslaved Africans, they practice Islam. While some of the men who sailed with Columbus, they think they might have been Muslim, their enslaved Africans became the first significant presence of Islam in the Americas. So you talk about these cultural exchanges, there's an effect right there. There's the religion. Several Catholic religious orders in Europe, like the Dominicans, the Jesuits, the Franciscans, they went to missionaries in Latin America to convert people to Christianity. And they're also successful today. In Latin America, the major religion there is Roman Catholicism. Another example of syncretism could be, I know when I was a kid, going over friends' houses in Southwest, man, the Virgin of Guadalupe, you'd see that picture everywhere. So that's like an example of you took something that was Roman Catholic, but you still had that Mexican cultural theme, right? So it's kind of a mixing, a hybrid. Afro-Eurasia is going to get all these syncretic religions. Religion plays a role. I think I'm going to explain this later in a later podcast and lectures. The split between the Sunni and the Shia Muslims, that's going to get worse. And we talk about Catholicism, Protestantism, Anglicanism. We'll talk about that later. I'll talk about Henry VIII. Crazy story. But yeah, you're seeing different religions and they're serving political purposes as well. Okay, I know this is kind of a long one, but this is a big topic for a lot of reasons. Please make sure you're familiar with the triangular trade map on 234. This topic has DBQ written all over it, guys. So make sure you know this.